Chapter 5 The Myth of the Separation of Powers. This is a famous text. Who is not familiar with the theory according to which every good government rigorously distinguishes between the legislature, the executive and the judiciary? That it guarantees the independence of each of these powers in order to obtain from this separation the advantages of moderation, security and liberty? Such, according to this theory, is in fact the secret of Book XI, conceived later than the first 10, and inspired in Montesquieu by the Revelation of England, where, during a stay in 1729–30, he discovered a radically new regime with no other object than liberty. Before Book XI, Montesquieu presented a classical theory, distinguishing different political forms, describing their peculiar economies and dynamics. He then threw off the mask of the dispassionate historian, and even, if it is to be believed, that of the partisan gentilhomme, to give the public the ideal of a nation with two chambers, an assembly of the third estate, and elected judges. Thereby, for some, Montesquieu at last reached the sphere of the political as such, and demonstrated his genius in a theory of the balance of the powers, so well arranged that power is itself the limit of power, thus resolving once and for all the political problem, which is entirely a matter of the use and abuse of power, for others, the political problems of the future greater than L, which are less those of monarchy in general than those of representative and parliamentary government. The temporal succession is in some sense the guarantee of this interpretation. Did not the age as a whole look to Montesquieu for arguments to weaken I? Prelate, op. Cit. Pages 123, I-29 FLF. 8.8 The monarchical order, to justify parliaments, and even for the convocation of the Estates General? Did not the American Constitution of the end of the century and the French Constitution of 1791 itself, not to speak of those of 1795 and 1848, consecrate Montesquieu's desired principles of the separation of powers in their arguments and dispositions? These two themes, the separation of powers, the balance of powers, are they not still current themes, still taken up and disputed in the very words established by Montesquieu? I hope to be able to argue that this is almost completely a historical illusion, and give reasons for it. In this vein, I should first like to make explicit all the articles of the jurist Charles Eisenman. 2 I should like to repeat the essential points of these articles here before extending their conclusions. Eisenman's thesis is that Montesquieu's theory, and in particular the famous chapter on the Constitution of England, has produced a real myth. The myth of the separation of powers. A whole school of jurists arose, particularly at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, which took advantage of a number of isolated formulations of Montesquieu's in order to impose on him a purely imaginary theoretical model. According to this model, Montesquieu's political ideal coincides with the regime in which this separation of powers is rigorously guaranteed. There should be three powers: the executive, the king, his ministers, the legislature, the lower and upper chambers, and the judiciary, the body of magistrates. Each power corresponds precisely to its own sphere, i.e. its own function, without any interference. Each power in each sphere is provided for by an organ rigorously distinct from the other organs. Not only can there be no encroachment of the executive onto the legislature or judiciary, or any reciprocal encroachment of the same kind, but also none of the parts constituting an organ can belong to any other organ. For example, not only can the executive not inter two. See in particular, Eisenman, L'esprit de l'os et la séparation des pouvoirs, Mélanges Carré de Malberg, Paris 1933, pp 163-92, La pensée constitutionnelle de Montesquieu, Recueil Syrie, Op. See it, pages 133-60. Montesquieu, Politics and History 8 Grands Venet in the legislature by proposing laws or in the judiciary by pressure, etc. Not only can no minister be responsible to the legislature, but also no member of the legislature can, in his personal capacity, assume executive and judicial functions, i.e. become a minister or a magistrate, etc. I leave aside the details of this logic, which is still alive in some people's minds. Eisenman's first audacity was to show that this famous theory quite simply does not exist in Montesquieu. A careful reading of his texts shows, in fact, 1. That the executive encroaches on the legislature, since the king has the power of veto. 2. That the legislature can to a certain extent exercise a right of inspection over the executive, since it checks on the application of the laws it has voted, and, without there being any question of ministerial responsibility to Parliament, can ask for accounts from the ministers. 3-4-56-3. That the legislature encroaches seriously on the judiciary, since, in 3 special circumstances, it sets itself up as a tribunal, in all matters, the nobles, whose dignity must be preserved from any contact with the prejudices of popular magistrates, will be judged by their peers in the upper chamber registered in questions of amnesty, and in questions of political trials, which are brought before the tribunal of the upper chamber on the impeachment of the lower chamber. 7-3. The executive power has no other part in the legislative than the power of rejecting. 4. The legislative power has a right, and ought to have the means, of examining in what manner its laws have been executed. The ministers must give an account of their administration. 5. The great are always obnoxious to popular envy, and, were they to be judged by the people, they might be in danger from their judges, and would moreover be deprived of the privilege, which the meanest subject is possessed of in a free state, of being tried by his peers. The nobility, for this reason, ought not to be cited before the ordinary courts of the judicature, but before that part of the legislature which is compounded of their own body. 6. It is possible that the law might, in some cases, be too severe. That part of the legislative body, which we have just now observed to be a necessary tribunal on another occasion, is also a necessary tribunal in this: it belongs to its supreme authority to moderate the law in favor of the law itself. 7. It might also happen, that a subject, entrusted with the administration of 90, it is hard to see how such important interferences of powers as these can be reconciled with the claimed purity of their separation. Eisenman's second audacity was to show that in fact Montesquieu is not concerned about the separation, but about the combination, fusion and liaison of these powers. 8 The essential point of this proof consists first of being clear that the judicial power is not a power in the true sense of the word. This power is in some measure, next to nothing, says Montesquieu. 9 And in fact, for him the judge is only a sight and a voice. It is a man whose only function is to read and speak the law. 10 This interpretation is disputable, but it must at least be admitted that in matters where the judge threatened to be more than an animated code, Montesquieu was careful to enact guarantees which are no longer legal but political. For example, look who judges the crimes and deliriums of the nobles in political cases. Once taken, these precautions which transfer any political effects the judiciary may have to more strictly political organs ensure that the rest of the judiciary really is next to nothing. We then confront two powers, the executive and the legislature. Two pouvoirs but three puissances, to use Montesquieu's own words. 11 These three public affairs may infringe the rights of the people. In general, the legislative power cannot try causes, and much less can it try this particular case, where it represents the party aggrieved, which is the people. It can only, therefore, impeach. But before what court shall it bring its impeachment? Must it go and demean itself before the ordinary tribunals, which are its inferiors, and, being composed moreover of men who are chosen from the people as well as itself, will naturally be swayed by the authority of so powerful an accuser? In order to preserve the dignity of the people and the security of the subject, the legislative part which represents the people must bring in its charge before the legislative part which represents the nobility, who have neither the same interests nor the same passions. 8. The legislative body being composed of two parts, they check one another. They are both restrained by the executive power, as the executive is by the legislative. The three powers are distributed and founded. 9. Of the three powers above mentioned, the judiciary is, in some sense, next to nothing. 10. The national judges are no more than the mouth that pronounces the words of the law, mere passive beings, incapable of moderating either its force or rigor. 11. Cf. The passage on Venice in SL, X1, 6, thus at Venice, the legislative power, pouvoir, is in the council, the executive in the pregati, and the judiciary in the quarantia. But the mischief is, that these different tribunals are composed of mages. Montesquieu, Politics and History. Gi puissances are the king, the upper chamber and the lower chamber, i.e. the king, the nobility and the people. Here Eisenman shows very convincingly that Montesquieu's true object is precisely the combination, the liaison of these three puissances. 12 That what is involved is above all a political problem of relations of forces, not a juridical problem concerning the definition of legality and its spheres. This casts light on the famous problem of moderate government. True moderation is neither the strict separation of powers, pouvoirs, nor a juridical concern and respect for legality. At Venice, for example, there are indeed three powers and three distinct organs, but the mischief is that these three organs are composed of magistrates all belonging to the same body, which constitutes almost one and the same puissance. SL 11, 6. Thus it is all very well to say that despotism is the regime in which a single person governs alone, without rules or laws, or that the despot appears in every prince or minister who goes beyond the law and abuses his power. At bottom, this is not what is at issue, for we are familiar with regimes in which despotism reigns even under the appearance of laws, and, says Montesquieu, that is the worst of tyrannies. 13 Moderation is something quite different. It is not mere respect for legality, it is the balance of powers, i.e. the division of the pouvoirs among the puissances, and the limitation or moderation of the pretensions of one puissance by the pouvoir of the others. The famous separation of powers is thus no more than the calculated division of pouvoir between determinate puissances, the king, the nobility and the people. I think that my remarks on despotism make it possible to go beyond these pertinent conclusions. For this illumination itself poses a question: to whose advantage is the division made? If we trace all belonging to the same body, which constitutes almost one and the same power, puissance. 12. Eisenman, La Pensée constitutionnelle de Montesquieu, Op. Id. pp. I-54 ff 13. No tyranny can have a severer effect than that which is exercised under the appearance of laws, and with the plausible colors of justice. Considerations, ch. 14. 9. Two were satisfied at having revealed beneath the mythical exterior of the separation of powers the real operation of a division of power between different political forces. We would risk encouraging the illusion of a natural division, one that occurs of itself and answers to an obvious equity. We have moved from powers to puissances. The terms have changed. The problem remains the same. It is never more than a question of balance and division. This is the last myth I hope to be able to expose. We can illuminate the meaning of this division and its ulterior motives, given of course that Montesquieu is concerned with the combination of puissances and not with the separation of powers, by examining all the possible encroachments of one power on another and all the possible combinations of one power with another, in order to find which encroachments and combinations are absolutely excluded. I have found two, which are of prime importance. The first excluded combination is for the legislature to usurp the powers of the executive, which would immediately consummate the collapse of monarchy into popular despotism. 14 But the inverse is not the case. Montesquieu accepts that monarchy may survive and even retain its moderation, if the king controls not only the executive, but also the legislative power. 15 But let the people become the prince and all will be lost. The second excluded combination is more famous, but to my mind it has been treated as too obvious and for that reason not fully examined. It concerns the investment of the judiciary and the executive, the king. Montesquieu is strict. This arrangement is enough to bring about the collapse of monarchy into despotism. If the king himself judged, the constitution by such means would be 14. Should the legislative power, puissance, usurp a share of the executive, the latter would be undone. If there were no monarch, and the executive power, puissance, should be committed to a certain number of persons, selected from the legislative body, there would be an end of liberty. Ibid. 15. In modern monarchies, the prince is invested with the executive and legislative powers, puissances, or, at least, with a part of the legislative, but does not act in a judiciary capacity. Most kingdoms in Europe enjoy a moderate government, because the prince, who is invested with the two first powers, pouvoirs, leaves the third to his subjects. Montesquieu, Politics and History 93 subverted, and the dependent intermediate power is annihilated, and the example he cites in the following pages is that of Louis XIII, who wanted to judge a gentleman himself, Ibid. If we compare this exclusion and the arguments for it, that if the king judges, the intermediate bodies are annihilated, on the one hand with the arrangement that only calls noblemen before a tribunal of their peers, and on the other with the misfortunes the despot reserves primarily for the great, we can see that this special clause depriving the king of judiciary power is important above all for the protection of the nobility against the political and legal arbitration of the prince, and that once again the despotism Montesquieu threatens us with designates a policy directed quite precisely against the nobility first of all. If we now return to the famous balance of the puissances, we can, I think, propose an answer to the question, to whose advantage does the division work? If we stop considering the forces invoked in Montesquieu's combination and look at the really existing forces of his day, we have to state that the nobility gains two considerable advantages from his project. As a class, it becomes directly a political force recognized in the upper chamber, also, by the clause which excludes royal power from the exercise of judgment, and also by that other clause which reserves this power to the upper chamber. Where the nobility is concerned, it becomes a class whose members' prospects, social position, privileges and distinctions are guaranteed against the undertakings of either the king or the people. As a result, in their lives, their families and their wealth, the nobility are safe both from the king and from the people. How better to guarantee the conditions for the permanent survival of a decadent class, whose ancient prerogatives are being torn from it and disputed by history? The counterpart to these assurances is another assurance, but this time one for the king's benefit. The assurance that the monarch will be protected by the social and political rampart of the nobility against popular revolutions. The assurance that he will not find himself in the situation of the despot, abandoned and alone face to face with his people and his passions. If he is prepared to learn 94 the lesson of despotism, the king will realize that his future is well worth a nobility. Not only will this nobility serve as a counterweight to the people, since, with a representation out of proportion to the numbers and interests of the masses, it will balance the representation of the people in the legislature, but also by its existence, its privileges, its luster and its luxury, even by its generosity. This nobility will teach the people in concrete daily life that greatness is respect-worthy, that there's a structure to the state, that it is far from the passion for power, that in the moderate space of a monarchy the distance of social conditions and the duration of political action are long-winded, in short, the wherewithal to discourage forever any idea of subversion. I see nothing in any of this which distances it from the basic aspirations of the theoretician of monarchy and despotism. The regime of the future '16 is, indeed, in many ways different from the monarchies of the Europe of the time. The latter still have the feel of their origins and their rudimentary constitutions are still primitive. They are poorly armed to fight the danger of despotism which threatens them and to resolve the complex problems of the modern world. But they can be said to contain in them, in their political and social structure, everything needed to satisfy this exigency. The representation of the people itself, which seems to contradict all his past positions, and has led some people to believe that Montesquieu was a Republican at heart and on the side of the Third Estate, is in the spirit of monarchy. Read Chapter 8 of Book XI, whose 6th chapter was precisely the one with the discussion of the English Constitution, and it will be clear that the principle of the representatives of a nation in a monarchy, a principle entirely foreign to antiquity, belongs to the very origins of Gothic government, the best species of constitution that could possibly be imagined by man. SL 11:8. That is why Montesquieu can say of the government which seems to look forward to the future, that the English found it in the woods of their past. I6. Prelate, Op. DT, p. 123. Montesquieu, Politics and History 95. Thus the analysis of the English Constitution leads essentially to the same point as the examination of monarchy and despotism, to the same point as certain of the reasons behind the theoretical principles of the opponent of the theorists of the social contract, to Montesquieu's political choice. This political choice may be masked for two reasons. First, Montesquieu's mode of reflection, the juridical purity and abstraction of his political analyses. I think that my more careful examination has shown that Montesquieu's juridicalism itself in its own way expresses his party But this choice may also be concealed by history, by the history that separates us from Montesquieu, and the history that Montesquieu himself lived. To understand this choice properly, it must be grasped in itself and in the history Montesquieu lived, in the history which he thought he was living, whereas it too was also acting on him behind his back.